Now, the Buckeye Extra podcast with Rob Aller, Bill Rabinowitz, and Joey Kaufman from the Columbus Dispatch.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first podcast of the season with an opposing beat writer. We have Chris Solari here from the Detroit Free Press. Chris, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Glad to do it, Bill. It's we're already one Big Ten game in up here in Michigan, so this is kind of a big jump off point for the Buckeyes.
Right. How long have you covered the Spartans?
Oh gosh, let me put it this way: my first game covering Michigan State football in college was Nick Saban's first game in 1995.
Oh wow!
The memorable Lawrence Phillips game where Nebraska came in and stomped all over them. But I've been at the Free Press since 2016, and I was 10 years at the Lansing State Journal before that. So I've seen some things, as the kids say.
Yeah, you certainly have. You certainly have. Well, and this edition of the Spartans is an interesting one. Obviously, first-year coach Jonathan Smith, after the craziness of last year. First of all, what was it like last year covering this team with the Mel Tucker, being fired before the season started? It was just insane, right?
It was. It was so strange just because you felt for the kids, because this wasn't a football performance issue. This wasn't a situation where these guys on the team he brought in all these transfers signing up for the riches and championships that Mel Tucker promised. And then to have it kind of 2 games in fall like that, with something off field that, I think obviously if you were around that program internally, you knew that something was amiss. But it happened so swiftly and so early in the season that it staggered them. And, a lot of those guys were left kind of in lurch. Some left for the portal right away. Some left for the portal after the season. Some tried to stick around for the new staff. But last year was one of the more interesting and difficult things. And I thought Harlan Barnett, to his credit, he was at Cincinnati with Mark D'Antonio and then went back to Michigan State, his alma mater, with D'Antonio. I thought Harlan held it together and kept that they won 2 more games was kind of an impressive thing to me. Because they got drilled by every big team that they played, from Ohio State to Washington to Michigan, to Penn State. They played all these top 10 teams and had all that turmoil going on around them. And they still were couple plays away at Rutgers and Iowa from making a bowl game. Right.
How big a coup was it for Michigan State to get Jonathan Smith?
I thought the athletic director, Alan Haller, and again, another former MSU football player, I thought he kept his cards close to the vest and played it really well, because the one thing about firing Tucker 2 games into the season is it gave him a long lead up to look at candidates. And I think he identified a guy that likes to run the ball, but is more of an offensive guy in this era. And, I thought that I don't think it was just a coup to get Jonathan Smith. I think, as we're seeing very early, I think Jonathan Smith getting Joe Rossi from Minnesota was as big of a coup as Smith coming to Michigan State, because they needed a defensive mind. They needed someone who could understand the Big Ten on that side of the ball, on the defensive side of the ball. And I think you get a perfect hybrid with the conference coming together with and melding with those West Coast teams. They have a West Coast offense and a Midwest defense. That's pretty good. But Smith, I think he's shown to be a pretty smart guy. He's fairly transparent. I think that he's also got just football savvy that only a quarterback can have. But he has perspective. It's a real, I want to say a culture shift, because I think that kind of connotates some negative things. And obviously there were some negative things with Mel Tucker's program, but I'm talking about like a culture shift from within the program, from D'Antonio and Mel Tucker, who come from that Belichick kind of tree, to someone who comes from it's just football mindset, but makes football pretty serious without it, without thinking you're reinventing the wheel or having brain surgery.
Right. He turned around an Oregon State program that was among the dregs in college football for seemingly forever, right? It was a generation. And and he made that program a winner. That's tough to win at Corvallis. It is tough to win. You don't have the Nike money. You don't have a recruiting base. You're the second banana in that state. And he was fairly successful. How has he already put his imprint? You kind of touched on this already. How has he already put his imprint on the program?
Well, I think that, obviously, probably the biggest imprint that he's had is the guys that he brought with him from the coaching staff, but also bringing Aiden Childs and Tanner Miller and Jack Velling. Those are, you talk about, in baseball, you talk about building down the middle, right? You talk about catcher, pitcher, middle infield, and center fielder. Well, right. You bring a quarterback, a center, and a tight end. It's the same thing in football. Especially a young quarterback who hasn't really worked. It was Child's first start, 4 weeks ago. He played 9 games as a true freshman at Oregon State, but this was his first start. This is the first time that he's got the ball and no one looking over his shoulder, or no reason to think he's only going to be in for a drive or two. So I think that's one of the big imprints that Smith brought with him. I think the second thing is that he's willing, and he brought obviously Brian Lindgren with him, and 2 offensive guys there, his offensive coordinator and Jonathan Smith. I think he's willing to take shots downfield, and that's something that we didn't necessarily see the last couple coaches with Michigan State. D'Antonio played more of a conservative style. He'd be content to beat you 17-14 or 16-13. Keep it low scoring. Ohio State fans know that he could do that there, but he could also win with that offensive firepower. Whereas Smith, I think the Maryland game in particular, you saw in a tie game them going over the top with Childs and Nick Marsh, and that's something that I don't necessarily know that we would have seen. Some of it's personnel, but I do think that Smith's willingness to kind of take big hits while also wanting to be a Big Ten team and run the ball, because that's what he did at Oregon State. I think that's the big imprint. And I think the other thing too, and this is important, I think from the historical standpoint, the one thing that Mark D'Antonio did probably better than any coach in Michigan State history is mined Ohio for that second tier of kids. And Ohio built Michigan State's program. I don't think it's any secret to that. Right. He got some kids from the Detroit area, but a lot of their best players and a lot of their stars and a lot of their championships came from guys in Ohio that either felt slighted they didn't get a Buckeye offer, didn't feel appreciated enough. Mel Tucker comes in, and if there's anything that baffles me more than how things ended for Mel Tucker, it's that a guy from Cleveland who worked at Ohio State completely ignored the state of Ohio in recruiting. Until they got the Lunieski kids out of Cincinnati, and I think Austin Clay in this class, they had like maybe 2 recruits from Ohio in 3 years at Michigan State. That doesn't even, right. Even if you're abandoning it, you should be able to get 1 or 2 kids. So
by accident. Right.
So I think that's the other thing. Smith made it a priority from day one to get back in the hallways in Ohio. And, he talked about it Monday during his press conference. This is a big game for Michigan State for eyeballs down there in Ohio. And, it's a big, I think I don't think he takes the same approach that D'Antonio did as a measuring stick. And he kind of cringed when I mentioned that, probably because I said, well, you had Oregon as a measuring stick at Oregon State. And I think there's probably a little bit of harsh feelings with that. But, but I do think that, D'Antonio used this game as a measuring stick on the field. Maybe that comes in time because there's a law. I mean, it's more than a measuring stick, and it's more than a yardstick that you're going to need, engineer rollout tape to figure out how far these two programs are apart right now.
Well, I mean, they hit rock bottom. I mean, Michigan State hit rock bottom. I mean, you fire a coach with a scandal, and it's always been kind of the I'm not going to use the Mike Hart thing, but it's always been the program that has to work harder and be more blue collar. And I mean, people here always think about Michigan, and especially in the heyday that they're getting a lot of Ohio kids. Well, Michigan State, even more so, probably needs the Ohio kids, because Michigan can recruit nationally more than Michigan State probably can recruit nationally. And so they have to get, it's like what Luke Fickell did at Cincinnati, and he's obviously got Ohio ties, and they're trying to get the Ohio State's even more of a national program now. It's all things being equal, they want the Ohio kid, but
it's going to keep Michigan and Ohio State are going to continue to get more and more national as NIL and the portal era grows.
So they've got to develop those relationships and get the 3-star kids they can develop, and hope that they can transfer and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, you bring up Luke Fickell, and I think that's a fascinating situation, because one of the things, and this started towards the end of Mark Antonio's time at Michigan State, and partly why some of the Ohio's kids dried up coming here is because Luke Fickell was doing such a good job at Cincinnati, because Mark Stoops down at Kentucky started making inroads. This guy from Youngstown. Listen, I mean, D'Antonio's blueprint was good for a lot of other people. A lot of people watched what D'Antonio did and kind of mirrored their program around that.
Right, and you're dealing with a demographic area. I mean, a geographical area where the demographics they're shrinking. I mean, the population is relatively declining, and so even Ohio State used to rely on Ohio for the bulk of the nucleus of their roster. They can't do that anymore, and so they try to get all the best Ohio kids, obviously, but it's not the foundation of the team the way it used to be 20, 30 years ago. It just isn't, because the players are generally down in the South or West.
Anyway, you used to be able to do that in Pennsylvania too, and
same thing.
That's happened for the last 25, 30 years there.
Yep. Not much was expected of the Spartans this year, certainly by outsiders. I don't know what was the thought inside the program and in East Lansing.
I think the thought inside the program was different than the thought in East Lansing. I think people in East Lansing were just happy to have a coach that they felt and they saw, like the first couple of weeks, that there's some competency back on both sides of the ball on the field. I think that inside the program, they had a pretty good gauge of the guys that they had, and I think they obviously, with Childs and with Velling and Miller, and I think they were happy with those guys. They lost guys in the portal on the defensive line and offensive line, so they were thin. So I think a lot of it going into the year was, how are those trenches going to be? Well, the defenses turned out to be really much better than I think anybody could have projected. I think they've got some good fit. I think they got some guys with who have a high motor and good presence at the line of scrimmage, blending them with guys they already had in the program, which I think that is critical. Whereas on the offensive line, I mean, they brought in Tanner Miller, and Luke Newman was a Holy Cross transfer playing up at guard, and the line one lost 2 right guards to injury. They lost the starting right guard and then his backup 2 games later. And now they're down to their 3rd right guard, who happened to be their starting left tackle. So there's a lot of reconfiguring. There's not a lot of depth because they lost so many guys to the portal. And really, when you lose top tier offensive linemen into the portal, there's not a lot of ability to replace them. They're kind of like the 7-footers in basketball, or you're not going to be able to just go and find them. So I think that, and they're trying to gel, and they're trying to get some of those young guys moving along. But I think they knew that there were depth issues, and their secondaries being tested with depth. But I think they were confident. I think they were confident that with Childs, they had the ability to be an explosive offense. And it's going to take some growing pains for that kid, and for the offense with the pressure that they're sustaining right now and playing through. But you are seeing the ability to be resilient. I think that was one thing they felt coming in, and they've been in three fourth quarter games already this season. So talent wise, thin layer up top that they really like that's been kind of chipped away at with the injuries. So we'll see how things play out from here, because this week is to me an incredibly pivotal week, not just facing the Buckeyes, but then a short prep, quick turn to the West Coast to play Oregon the following Friday. I mean, you're already dealing with injury issues. I mean, they got a bye weeks on the other side of that before facing Iowa, I believe. Iowa and Michigan back to back. So it's not, the schedule's not very favorable in this. And then you look down the line and they still got to play Indiana and Illinois, who both look so much better. I mean, markedly better than they did a year ago. Kind of tells you how quickly the portal can catch you up if you got a good foundation. But there's no gimmies on this schedule really for Michigan State. So they're going to have to be resilient. They're going to have to grind. And I know they like that. They like the makeup of the team, but the mental makeup versus the physical makeup at this point with the injuries is a little bit different.
Right. Again, we're joined here by Chris Solari from the Detroit Free Press to preview the Michigan State game on Saturday here on the BuckeyeXtra Football Podcast. Spartans beat Florida Atlantic 16-10 in the opener, beat Maryland, nice win, 27-24 in the second game. I'm not sure how good Maryland is, but still, it's a nice, good Big Ten win. Played
on the road.
On the road, right. Played Prairie View A&M, which is, what that is, 40-0. And then a tough game last week. I watched that, Boston College in the rain, and Spartans could have won that one. Probably should have won that one.
Probably should have. Yeah.
I don't know if devastating is the right word, but how disappointing was that?
Yeah, I mean, they only brought two guys to the post game, and I mean, one, I don't know, normally I'd be a little frustrated with that, but I get it. And mostly because of the conditions, because it rained the entire time that we were in Boston. It felt like fall, late fall showed up in a hurry. So that was football weather, and it was a tough loss. It was a tough loss because guys knew that Aiden Childs missed some wide open receivers that would have put him up big, really, in that game. They outgained Boston College. They smothered a really mobile quarterback in Thomas Castellanos. I think he had 15 yards on 15 carries. That's a guy that really went off on Florida State, who we know now is not very good, but also did some things against Missouri on the road. So, I mean, that Boston College team was a veteran group, particularly in the trenches where Michigan State has some newness to it. And they were right there. I think they, couple tweaks here and there, like the last touchdown, for instance, both Malik Spencer and Angelo Gross, speaking of recruiting Ohio, both Angelo Gross is a kid from Mansfield, I believe, but both those guys went out in the middle of the drive with injuries. Avion Gross, Angelo's younger brother, who just transferred in, and Armorian Smith come in and replace them. Castellanos attacks them right away. The presence of a veteran quarterback, seeing and knowing that. Then Spencer and Angelo Gross both come back in hobbled, and he attacks them deep and beats them on a 42-yard touchdown pass. I mean, poor timing there, but also you saw the difference between Aiden Childs as a young quarterback still learning some reads and recognitions and how to put some touch on balls rather than throwing fastballs versus the Castellanos, who's been beaten all day by Michigan State's defense, stopped on 4th and 1 twice at the goal line, fumbled once and then got stuffed on a turnover and downs. He stays resilient and comes back and throws a touchdown pass by reading the defense. And it was a tough one for them. And Michigan State knew, talking to Wayne Matthews, Jordan Turner, the linebacker, he said, we let this one get away. I mean, that's kind of it.
Let's talk about Childs. Comes from Oregon State. He's thrown 4 touchdown passes, but 7 interceptions. I don't know. I mean, interceptions, kind of like sacks, they can be misleading stats. Sometimes it's not the quarterback's fault. But 4 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, that's not a good ratio.
It's not. And I mean, he had 3 picks against Boston College. We talk about the injury situation. They had their top 4 wide receivers out with injuries.
Are they going to be back this week?
They're questionable. Nick Marsh, freshman phenom who had the big game against Maryland, he got hit in the knee in the Prairie View game in the first half, played through it, and then was on the injury report late week. Jonathan Smith said him and Jerron Glover went through till Thursday, and they were trying to get healthy and play, and they couldn't last week. And it sounds like it's going to be a similar situation this week of a late week decision on those 2 guys, plus Antonio Gates Jr. And they already lost Alante Brown, the Nebraska transfer, who started the first game. They lost him in week 1. So, I mean, 4 guys down. That's part of the issue, I think, last week. But at the same point, Jonathan Smith said Child's decision-making versus letting balls get away from him was a bigger issue. I think some of them he's tried to take some shots. In the Prairie View game in particular, he took a deep shot to the end zone that, ends up being basically a punt. First game of the year, he had a couple that were juggled and bobbled and got picked off.
Right.
So, it's kind of a mixed bag. I don't think the numbers kind of tell a lot of the story. I mean, listen, the touchdown pass he threw to Nick Marsh, it was a beautiful pass. I mean, the guy's got a big arm. He's got mobility, as we saw in the Boston College game, to escape pressure, and he's going to need it. I mean, I think Michigan State needs to do more with him in design run plays. But, I also understand that they don't want to turn him into a running quarterback. They want him to be a pocket passer. And that's why he's sticking with Jonathan Smith too. So
you mentioned the offensive line earlier with the injuries they've had. I mean, the defensive line is obviously a strength for Ohio State. Actually, last week against Marshall, the defensive line did not dominate. I don't say Marshall owned the line of scrimmage, but it was not the dominating performance that Ohio State hoped for. They were without Tyleik Williams, and we don't know his status. But I would still, Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau and Ty Hamilton and a very deep bunch of backups. And so I would figure that's probably the biggest concern for Michigan State is how do they block Ohio State up front? Is that true?
Oh, easily. I mean, that's going to be their biggest concern all year. And, they lost so many guys. They lost, I think at least 4 or 5 offensive linemen from last year's team, a couple starters that, including Geno Vandemark, who I thought had a really nice future and ends up transferring to Alabama. They lost Ethan Boyd, who transferred, I think, to Colorado eventually, and I think he's now out of football at the moment. They lost Spencer Brown, the starting right tackle last year, to Oklahoma. So, the talent they lost didn't just go down. It went up, and some would say. So, you look at that, how are you going to replace that? Some of those guys they lost after spring ball. You can't replace it at that point either. So I think that, the depth, they brought, I think, 3 or 4 true freshmen on that trip to Boston College. I know they're trying to get them up to speed where maybe they can contribute. So that's not an enviable situation if you're going to have to put true freshmen out there against the Buckeyes. That's literally like throwing sheep right into the wolf's den. So I think that we'll see. But that's going to be an issue all year for Michigan State, just trying to figure out the best 5 guys and keeping them healthy.
Ron Lynch Adams, their primary running back, describe his game.
Well, he's actually hasn't started. Nate Carter, who started last year, continues to start, but I think he had 9 carries for 9 yards at Boston College. For some reason, we talk about the offensive line issues. Every time Nate Carter takes a handoff, he's grabbing the ball and 2 guys are in his face in the backfield. So I don't know if it's something that he's doing, something that the offensive line is doing, but he's getting hit probably more than anybody in the backfield. Lynch Adams is a guy that transferred in from Massachusetts,
right,
and has shown some burst and shown some ability to kind of make some big plays. So does Carter, but then they've made some big plays and big runs this year, the two of them. They're kind of a 1-2 situation right now, riding a hot hand, but they're not a lot of 3, 4, 5, 6 yard gains. They're either feast or famine.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that comes straight from the offensive line.
Yeah. On defense, I mean, we know what Michigan State's traditionally been. I mean, they've been the press corners, very aggressive. Are they still playing that style?
Yeah, Joe Rossi's defense is maybe a little more, I guess, willing to do some things that Mark Antonio's wasn't, but it's a lot closer to the style of Mark Antonio's than what Mel Tucker and Scotty Hazelton were running. They're trying to force guys to the outside again instead of into the middle of the field. They're not running that 3-3-5. They're not running soft 10-yard off coverage. They're aggressive. They swarm to the ball. It's more of a 4-3 look. Sometimes they'll drop a nickel guy in there for instead of a third linebacker. They kind of mix that up and they've got some personnel in the middle now that they can do that with bringing in a bunch of transfer linebackers who I think have made an impact, and having guys like Cal Halladay and Jordan Hall carry over from last year. So, yeah, I mean, I think Joe Rossi was great. Like I said earlier, he's a great hire because he understands the Big Ten. He understands the Midwest, having been a Pittsburgh guy who came from the Central Catholic football powerhouse in Pittsburgh, and having been at Minnesota. And that you're seeing that. And I think that's maybe the one thing we talk about, the excitement level around the program in East Lansing. What people have seen from his defense, Joe Rossi's defense, I think probably is as excited as anybody has been since Pat Narduzzi was here about Michigan State's defense. Okay. So, I mean, that's a pretty good credit.
Well, that kind of, you may have just answered my next question. If you're an Ohio State fan, if you're talking to an Ohio State fan and this is the beginning of a rebuilding project for Jonathan Smith. The offensive line is decimated already. What should Ohio State fans fear or be concerned with from Michigan State?
Well, I think the fact that they've been tested already. That's something that when you get a team that's wounded and backed into a corner in some ways after a first loss, if they haven't been tested previously, they've shown the ability to rebound and be resilient. So, I mean, I think the other thing is Childs has shown the ability to be a dynamic game changer. And, he's one of those guys that if you don't account for him with 11 sets of eyes, he's going to beat you with his arm and beat you with his legs. He might also beat his own team with his arm and legs too, because he's so young and growing. But he is someone I think compared him like Anthony Richardson the other day. He's got next level potential. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Michigan State's had a quarterback like that since Drew Stanton, maybe Jeff Smoker, maybe never. He's not a game manager guy, so he can beat you. That's, if there's one thing that, you see and you get in a one game situation like that, particularly a guy who has that star quality and star power, sometimes when the lights get the brightest, they get the best. So I think that would be one thing I'd be concerned about.
All right. Well, Chris, appreciate your time very much here. Thanks for enlightening us about the Spartans, and look forward to Saturday night's game. I think Ohio State fans are happy to get in the Big Ten play. So thank you for joining us.
You got it, Bill, and I hope you guys make safe trips up here, and we will see you on Saturday.